Ascending tracts carrying the sensory information from our skin, from our muscles, tendons, and joints to the brain through the spinal cord and brainstem. So if you look at here, at the top we have the brain. This is the coronal section of the brain. This is the right hemisphere, left hemisphere of the brain. In the middle you can see the brainstem. So it's comprised of the midbrain at the top, pons in the middle, and medulla down here. And finally, this area is known as the spinal cord. And behind the brainstem, this blue represents the right and left hemispheres of the cerebellum. And if you take a cross section through the spinal cord, you can see this butterfly shape at the center. It is called the gray matter, which is surrounded by the white matter. So gray matter has two horns, ventral horns anteriorly, dorsal horns posteriorly, and white matter has different columns. So it's called lateral columns, ventral columns, and dorsal columns. And here outside the spinal cord you can see the dorsal root. On the way of the dorsal root we have the this bulb is called dorsal root ganglion, and anteriorly we have ventral root. And these two roots come together and make a spinal nerve. So we have lots of ascending tracts. I'm going to start by having a look at the SpinoThalamic tract. SpinoThalamic tract, as its name suggests, it starts at the level of the spinal cord and runs all the way up through the spinal cord and then passing through the brainstem to get into the thalamus in brain, and then finally to get into the cerebral cortex, somatosensory cerebral cortex. So spinothalamic tract. What is the function of the spinothalamic tract? Spinothalamic tract carrying the sensory information from the skin. Which sensory information? It's pain, temperature, crude or non-discriminative touch, and pressure. And also it has three order neurons, first, second, third order neurons. So the question is that, where is the cell body of these three order neurons and where they are synapsing to each other? The cell body of the first order neuron is usually here within the dorsal root ganglion. And it's a unipolar neuron. Unipolar means that it has only one process coming off from the cell body, and then it splits into peripheral and central branch. So it's carrying the sensory information from the skin into the dorsal horn of the gray matter, and then here it synapses onto the cell body of the second order neuron, which is within the dorsal horn of the gray matter. And then the axon of the second order neuron crossing from one side to the other side, it's called decussation, passing through this white matter. It's called anterior white commissure, and it lands here in the ventral and lateral column of the white matter. And then it runs all the way up, so it's running up through the spinal cord and passing through the brainstem to get into the thalamus. Into the thalamus, it synapses onto the second order neuron. Sorry, the third order neuron. The cell body of the third order neuron is within the thalamus. And the axon exiting the thalamus to get into the somatosensory cortex of the brain. So you can see the pathway of this tract, how it's carrying this sensory information from the skin to the somatosensory of the cortex. So the second ascending tract is known as the dorsal column tract. Dorsal column tract, so as its name suggests, it would be here in the dorsal white column. So where is the cell body of the first, second, and third order neurons and where they are synapsing to each other? So as I mentioned before, the cell body of the first order neuron is usually here within the dorsal root ganglion, and it splits into two branches, peripheral and central, and then it gets into the dorsal column tract without synapsing onto the cell body of the second order neuron. So the second order neuron of this tract is not here into the spinal cord. So it runs all the way up through the spinal cord to get into the two nuclei in the medulla oblongata, we have two nuclei here. It's called cuneate and gracile nuclei. So it synapses onto the cell body of the second order neuron, which is within the gracile and cuneate nuclei, and then axon coming out, the second order neuron axon coming out and crossing the medulla oblongata from one side to the other side is called decussation, and then it runs all the way up to get into the thalamus. Into the thalamus, it synapses onto the cell body of the third order neuron, and then axon coming out, getting into the somatosensory cortex. So as you see, dorsal column tract first order neuron runs all the way up through the dorsal column of the white matter, getting into the gracile and cuneate. So cuneate receives the sensory information from the upper limb, gracile receives the sensory information from the lower limb, and then second order neuron axon crossing or decussating from one side to the other side into the medulla oblongata, and then it goes up to get into the thalamus to synapses onto the cell body of the third order neuron, and finally the third order neuron getting into the somatosensory cortex. So which kind of the information it's carrying? It's carrying the touch. It's called discriminative touch or fine touch, and it's also carrying some proprioceptive, the conscious proprioceptive, and it's also carrying the vibration to the brain. So the third ascending tract is Spinocerebellar Tract. So as its name applies, it starts at the level of the spinal cord and gets into the cerebellum. Where is the cell body of the first, second, and third order neuron, and what is the function of the spinocerebellar tract? So as I mentioned before for these two previous tracts, spinocerebellar tract also first order neuron cell body is within the dorsal root ganglion here. It's a unipolar. It splits into peripheral and central branch, and then it synapses onto the second order neuron, which is within the dorsal core of the gray matter, and the axon of the second order neuron landing here into the lateral white column. And then it runs all the way up without crossing or decussating to get into the cerebellum. So that's why it's called spinocerebellar. Just keep in mind, there is no decussation for the spinocerebellar. So spinocerebellar tract, we have two spinocerebellar tracts. One of them is dorsal, the other one is the ventral. The ones that I showed you is the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. But the ventral spinocerebellar tract, is cell body is here. The first order neuron cell body is the dorsal root ganglion, and then it comes into the dorsal horn synapses under the second order neuron cell body, and the second order neuron cell bodies and axons crossing or decussating the spinal cord and landing here, and then it runs all the way up like this, and then it goes up, and again it's decussating at the level of the cerebellum to getting into the same side. So the point is that ventral spinocerebellar tract can do two decussation, two times crossing from one side to the other side. One of them happens into the spinal cord, you can see here. The other one happens into the cerebellum. So ventral spinocerebellar tract can do two times decussation, whereas the dorsal, there is no decussation. So it means that both dorsal spinocerebellar and ventral spinocerebellar, they are getting into the same side. If they are coming from the left side of the body, they are getting into the left hemisphere of the cerebellum. And they are carrying the unconscious proprioceptive into the cerebellum.